Okay, comrade, could you give me your name and tell me something about your political background and how you came to be in South Africa and your current position at UCT as a um, activist, as a lecturer, and also as a PhD student?
Okay, my name is Faisal Garba. I'm from Ghana. I got to South Africa in 2010. I was then doing my master's at the University of Freiburg. So I spent a semester at the University of Cape Town. I met some, fairly interesting faculty members who thought of the world in a much more radical fashion, and I decided to come back to UCT for my PhD. So I'm currently doing my PhD in the Department of Sociology, and I'm looking at African migrant workers in Europe. So basically forms of organizing and community and unions and social movements. I teach two courses. One is social theory, and the other is a part of a course called Society and Change, where I basically look at migration in Africa and out of Africa, and working class forms of organizing as a result of migration.
As you're talking, I can see a RoAPE paper developing. Could you tell me briefly about your organisational affiliation at UCT and what structures you're involved in here?
Yeah. Okay, maybe I should begin with a bit on my political history. So I went to the University of Ghana where I did my undergraduate degree, and I was a member of the ISO, the International Socialist Organization. At the University of Ghana, we call it SWIS, Student Worker Solidarity Society. So really that was my political grounding. When I got to South Africa, of course, I joined KIPLEF, which is continuation of the IS tendency. And at the University of Cape Town, I work with the Left Student Forum. So the UCT Left Student Forum is an organization of students which specifically works with outsourced workers on campus. So these are some of the unpaid, the least paid workers on campus, including cafeteria shop workers. Some of these workers are only employed during the session. Some are paid less than 3,000 rands a month without any benefits whatsoever. So the LSF, tries to support these workers' struggle for insourcing and for a living wage.
Brilliant. Thank you, comrade. It's been a fairly extraordinary year for campus and student politics in South Africa, particularly at UCT. Can you talk a little bit about your own experiences focusing on this year, just to give us some background before we go into the more recent events?
Yeah, so I was in Germany when the Rhodes Must Fall movement began. But I remember once, I think it was in 2013, a friend and I were passing by the Rhodes statue, and we said, we wish we had a dagger, to kind of pull this off.
Remind the viewers of the website the significance of Cecil Rhodes, if they're not aware of.
Well, so Cecil Rhodes basically was a mining magnate, colonialist, thoroughbred colonialist, and imperialist of the highest order. Who exacted the maximum amount of profit from workers across Southern Africa. He had a vision of Cape to Cairo, basically a pan-colonial vision, so to speak. And he, for example, today is associated with the famous Rhodes Scholarship at the University of Oxford, which is still being funded on the backs of exploitation of workers by mining companies linked to his estate today. So Rhodes basically represents the continuation of the massive exploitation of labor across the African continent and the dehumanization of workers, which was profoundly played out in Marikana, where workers whose entire lives ravaged by diseases caused by mining were shut down, were gunned down by police, for fighting for a living wage. So it's a historical context which plays out in stupendous fashions on a daily basis today.
And his statue was
Yes.
centerpiece at your university.
Yes. So the statue was occupying a prime position. You know, it's a brooding statue. You know, occupying a prime position on campus. And for many students, actually, and lecturers or people in the university community, that was an affront. To them on a daily basis, to see this racist of the highest order, this exploiter of the highest order, occupying prime position with acknowledgements from the university. And that is, for me, that's the worst aspect of it. The university, for example, insisted that they are grateful to Rhodes for having donated the land to them. And the argument people made is that, well, how can you be grateful to someone for having donated a stolen item to you? But the university was adamant, and a very powerful movement insisted that we can live on this campus, glorifying the legacy of such an exploiter, a racist, a colonialist of the highest order. And you had a broad-based student movement against the statue. It was called Rhodes Must Fall. Unfortunately, I was in Germany when it began, but luckily I had to come down for a conference in Johannesburg, and I just flew to Cape Town, to leave this exciting moments. I must say, when I first got to Cape Town, I was incredibly disappointed with student activism on campus. In 2010, this place was a very serene middle to upper class space, where people were preparing for their calling in the service of the status quo. Black and white students were incredibly apathetic. They were inculcated in the most conservative upper class values, saw ordinary people as lazy, as wards of the state, as incapable of thinking. So it was a certain colonial mission that students were trained for, irrespective of their race. And that moment shattered this outlook. You had people whose social class location means that they had nothing to do with those riffraffs, the working class. But now they were facing structural constraints that made them to begin to question their place in the world, but also forces them to begin to realize how complicit they are in continuing forms of oppression, whether it's along class, race, and so on.
Brilliant. So from that taste you got of the Rhodes Must Fall movement in March, April this year, fast forward to Fees Must Fall. Can you describe how these developments took place, how we managed to transition quite quickly, it seemed, from a movement around removing the statue and its legacy on the institution, and this UCT-based movement as a wing of an increasingly growing movement across South Africa? How do you see that development?
Yeah, I think what the campaign against the statue did was to radicalize a generation of students. And my reading of the situation is that you had a layer of working class students, from the township. These are the urban ghettos that are parted, carved for black people, who were talking about the statue as a metaphor for dispossession. The statue represents for them the continuing lack of access to education, lack of access to decent healthcare, lack of access to decent shelter, and an institutional culture at UCT which increasingly alienates them, which makes them feel they have to become something else in order to fit in. And so this conversation went national in that you had students in other campuses and students and learners in communities that were beginning to talk to each other. Were beginning to synthesize their experiences, to find ways of connecting, but also ways of campaigning for a different university. But that meant that you could not transform, you could not change or decolonize, as most activists will insist, of decolonizing the university outside of the broader issues of inequality in society. Okay, so the issues of gender was central. The issues of a living wage was central. The issues of housing for all, the issues of healthcare. So I think fees must fall, therefore, was one of the pillars of the struggle that had emerged, but also because fee is central to access. University education for a very long time has been a middle class prism. And so working class students who get in here are highly indebted. One, because they do not have parents that can bankroll them. So what it means is that the huge responsibilities that many working class kids have to carry after university education cannot be met because they have to pay back loans, part of which is education loans incurred as a result of educating themselves, but also lifestyle related loans. You're this young middle class or aspiring middle class person who needs a car, you need a house in a suburb, but then there's a disjuncture between the middle class aspirations, so between one's class destination and your class origins. And so this disjuncture means that people who might at times want to distance themselves from their class origins cannot do that, because structurally it is impossible for them to do that. So it is this radicalization of people who have been going through an educational system which consciously tries to, if you like, trim them in the way such that they could fit into the system. So I think, but also critical in the issue, in the campaign for of Fees Must Fall, is the issue of outsourcing. So across campuses and in many aspects of public life in South Africa, outsourcing or the privatization of public goods, is one way in which capital is able to practically steal from the public kitty. So in 1999 at UCT, under Mampela Rampele, who was the first black Vice Chancellor of the University of Cape Town, the decision was taken to outsource cleaning workers, bus drivers, security guards, gardeners. And the argument was that the university has got a core function, and that is teaching and research. Every other function is auxiliary. And she is reported to have said that we have to get rid of dead woods, so these are dead woods. But that fed into a thinking, right? Or that was the culmination of a particular thinking. I mean, in South Africa, for example, people argue that neoliberalism was something that the ANC, so to speak, had to contend with. But the reality is, even at the times of the negotiations, there are people who were totally adjusted to the idea of linked government, to the idea of people taking responsibility for their actions. The whole symbolic violence that working class people have to face, and which is broadly, across the continent in the 80s. So it's basically a structural adjustment in a different fashion. So cost recovery in South Africa was the structural adjustment, and on university campuses, it was outsourcing. It was higher fees. So because of the connection, one, between fees and people's access to education, and the ability to access other basic necessities, and two, outsourcing, which makes it impossible for workers to live decent lives. So these two campaigns challenged the consensus around neoliberalism in South Africa, and that is why I felt it was a national issue beyond the universities. It is questioning the socio-economic framework at large.
Very interesting. So you're saying that Fees Must Fall morphed automatically into questions of outsourcing, which has now become a campaign for insourcing, which has been won, at least in the first instance, by the major universities of WITS and UCT. Is that how you would see it? How would you describe the dynamic that's taking place at UCT, for example, between workers and students? How's that developed? Just a brief indication of that.
Yeah. So at UCT, right from the beginning, the campaign against the hike in fees was also a campaign against outsourcing. The keywords were #Fees Must Fall, #End Outsourcing. Okay, and so workers were central Now, what happened was that at the beginning of the campaign, workers could not join. One, because they had to be at posts. And so there was a demand that workers, through the Joint Shop Stewards Council, which is the body that represents all shop stewards from the different outsourced companies, the body met and made a demand on management to allow workers to join the protest as long as the protest continued. Management was arrogant when the demand was made initially, but then pressure from workers and students forced them to do that. And so workers became very active in this campaign. But of course, with every struggle, you have all kinds of contradictions. So when the victory, when workers won the victory with solidarity from students, management, in a very sneaky fashion, had a clause in the agreement inserted, which says that both parties, management and the union represented by workers, will ensure that normal university functions resume. Okay, so it was placing the onus on workers to get students to stop the struggle for free education. And so workers now felt that continuing with the protest would jeopardize the agreement. But also there was a division among, some workers were not happy with the fact that the representative body, the Joint Shop Stewards Council, signed the agreement without coming back to workers to check, say, this is what management is offering. Are you okay with that before we sign? The argument is that, they thought they had the mandate of workers, because workers always said, get us in-source, and now the university is offering to get them in-source. Now, the argument that workers who are unhappy are making is that, we want to be in-source with a living wage. Okay, we just don't want to be in-source. And the shop stewards are saying, we believe this is a struggle, it's a continuing struggle, so we've been in-source. We'll make sure we fight for the other things like living wage and job security. But there's another divide, which is happening. And for that reason, some students, for example, feel that by signing onto that agreement, which in a way cajoles workers into demobilizing students, that workers have sold out. It's not an argument I buy. I think it's a very limited argument, because it somehow assumes that students delivered this victory to workers, and also plays into the tricks of management, trying to see students as instigators, but the reality is there's a collective struggle of workers and students, who face largely similar situations, and a significant layer of students in this campaign of working class origins, face the same violence of going back to a home without food, of having to sleep in a leaking house, and so on.
Excellent. Just three more questions. The first one is, in terms of the mass student action that we've seen, particularly in the last few weeks, on a scale unprecedented in the last 20 years, really, how would you assess its significance? So that's one part of the question. How important is this in relation to other protest movements that there have been so far in South Africa? And then how do we understand this crisis in relation to the fracturing of the alliance to some extent, and the crisis in the ANC government?
Yeah. So as you know, South Africa is described as the protest capital of the world. So you have daily service delivery protests in communities for healthcare, education, housing, because it is the most unequal country on the continent. So you have a layer of super wealthy of all races that is emerging, that is consolidating its wealth within South Africa, but also across the continent. If you go to the DRC, for example, South African mining magnates like Motsepe have got specific areas that they've carved out for themselves in that country. And so naturally that means that the amount of social goods that is available to the poor becomes progressively very little if a few people are taking away the entire pie. And so Fees Must Fall ties into these protests of ordinary people who are impoverished deliberately by state policy of, empowering the rich, kind of a welfare for the rich. And so my sense of what is happening is that this is a further cap on the clear message that ordinary people are putting across, that we cannot continue to live under these conditions, that there are enough resources, there is enough resources to go around everyone to meet our basic needs, and basically questioning the idea that somehow if you continue on this path, inequality will solve itself. People are saying you are actively creating inequality, you are actively enriching others. We would not accept this logic. I think the second question,
how this movement ties in and impacts on the crisis in the ANC, the legitimacy of the government.
Yeah. So it's interesting to note that in this movement, people who are openly affiliated to the ANC, for example, SASCO, people from the ANC Youth League, whose affiliation to the ANC is not enough to pay the university bill. Okay, but also for many who are involved in the struggle, it's not a struggle just targeted at university management, because the reality is university management cannot offer free education. That's the reality, because they have to rely on the state, and progressively the state is decreasing the amount of money that it provides for education. Okay, so the hegemony of the ANC has been questioned by people who are within its structures, people who at times even put on its t-shirts and go to marches. Okay, of course there are issues about the ways in which some of these people try to hold back militancy and so on. But I think the student activists in this are not just questioning university management, they are questioning the state. They're saying we want a different future. They're saying that the economic framework does not work for us. So basically they are breaking away from the hold, the nostalgic hold that the ANC has had on people. We delivered liberation. People are saying, no, we collectively liberated ourselves, and now we also want to liberate ourselves on an everyday basis. We want to be able to afford the basic necessities of life. So I think this is, and that for me explains the decision by the president to intervene, and say, okay, the hikes.
And that's on the 23rd of October, when he said zero fee increase for 2016.
Yes, but the students are saying no. There's a very nice placard that I saw, and it says unaffordable plus 0% equals unaffordable. Okay, so people are not just talking about the increment, people are talking about the unaffordable fees, and people are talking about the conditions that many students have to live in. And the fact that this is directly related to the fact that they do not have rich parents, as the ministers as the kids of ministers do. And so they want the resource of society to be used to provide the basic necessities that we all need.
Brilliant. Okay, now I promise you my two final questions. One quickly about the sort of organisations that have emerged in the last year, and the language that students are now expressing themselves in. So the kind of new radicalism that speaks of intersectionality, and also a resurgent and confident black nationalism. How would you understand that? And then we'll move on to my absolutely final question.
Yeah, no, I think because of the pernicious legacy of racism in South Africa, one cannot attempt for a second to suspend the racial questioning in this country. It is still structurally playing itself out, and also at the interpersonal level. Discrimination is an everyday reality. But my view is that people are not racially ordered in an undifferentiated manner. Okay? And I think class location is an important way through which racism operates. And I'll just give you a small example. If you take the first generation of African scholars, in some parts of the continent, one can say from late 1800s, and other places late 1900s, and so on. Now, some of these people were steeped in a particular outlook that they differentiated themselves from the native, from the Kafir, from the Bantu. Okay, so those people actually saw themselves as extension of the civilizing mission. Okay, so in South Africa, for example, some of these educated Africans became radicalized after the vote was withdrawn from them around the Cape. Okay, because they were aghast, that why would you do this to us and return us to the level of the Kafir, of the native, when we have all your education, when we have the required amount of property. Okay, so such that now it is not a straightforward thing. There's no straightforward correlation between race and disempowerment. Although there is a great deal of association. Okay, and therefore, while I think that the language of intersectionality and the analytic resource that it makes available is incredibly important in our kinds of societies, but because of my own bias of being a Marxist, I insist that people's location in the distribution of resources in society is central to the way in which they are racialized, even their gender experiences. So there are many instances where women employers, for example, use patriarchal language and patriarchal social relations to relate to their domestic workers who are women. Okay, so all I'm saying is that this language and this rich theoretical insight that intersectionality brings has helped the movement a great deal. But I also think because of the multi-class nature of this movement, it has made it possible for middle class and upper middle class elements to refuse to recognize their complicity in the structures of oppression and disempowerment, such that you can make the argument that, well, we are all black, so we have similar experiences of dispossession, and for me that one is ahistorical, but two, it has pernicious violence on ordinary working class black people, because it reduces the structural disempowerment that they still suffer to their individual failings. And for me, that is insidious. That is unacceptable. So I strongly think that the resurgent self-assertion of young black people is incredibly important in this racist and racialized society. But I also insist that one has to understand the context, the historical context of racism in Africa. Racism was not a self-generating phenomenon in Africa. It was tied with the search for resources. You had to find ideological justifications for stealing, basically. And so these people are subhuman. The structure of their brains conditioned them to act in primitive ways. Okay, and I always tell my friends that actually, if one were to do a historiography of race, the very emergence of the term race in Europe was used to differentiate the upper classes from those down there. They are not of our stock. They're from an inferior ilk, and so for me, it is this ability to understand how we ideologize things out of vision that for me is central, and which I think has to become more grounded as we talk about intersectionality, the various ways in which people are disempowered. Because I think people are not just racist because they're structured to be racist. People are conditioned to be racist because there are specific privileges and advantages that racism tries to make invisible.
Thank you. And just a few words, if you don't mind, to finish up on your own experiences in Ghana as an activist and as a student and as a socialist. What are the lessons that this South African student movement and the emergent workers movement can learn from what's happened elsewhere on the continent, and Ghana in particular?
Excuse me. I think if I begin broadly from the continent, so what structural adjustment did, okay, one was to roll back the gains that ordinary people had made in the immediate post-colonial period. The insistence that we did not engage in the anti-colonial struggle in order to have flags. We want material changes. We want to be able to send our kids to school. We want to be able to live in decent houses. We want to be able to have healthcare, electricity, and so on. Structural adjustment said to them that you cannot have those things because you do not have the money to pay for those things. So structural adjustment practically disempowered people. Okay, it changed society from one in which people thought of a collective organization of society to meet our collective needs, to one in which it became, your ability to pay, in crude terms. So I think the lesson, which I think we have to be careful with, which we have to take cognizance of going forward, is that in these struggles, we have to make sure that it does not become about individual advancements. We have to make sure that we are not struggling for a layer of educated people who practically think of maintaining the system, but to have free education. Basically, that education must become struggle. That the process of fighting for free education must also be a process for fighting for a different kind of society. Because part of the justification given by African leaders, when they were smashing the university, this was a privileged layer, of people who would reproduce themselves socially, so they have to pay for it. But I think what we have to do going forward is to make sure that this struggle is about the most wretched of the earth. When Fanon said the last shall be the first, so it has to be centering that last. It has to be actively trying to decenter ourselves. The final thing, before the final thing, I have had interesting debates about, with students around decolonization at UCT, and their argument is that we need, more radical, African material. The curriculum has to be changed. And I say I completely agree with you, but just that I think this is a bit of a conservative demand. We actually have to change the very foundation of knowledge. What colonialism did at the epistemic level in Africa is to devalorize and denigrate the knowledges of ordinary people, is to give a certain layer of educated Africans the validity and the voice to project themselves as scholars, and most of us still benefit from that validation. So what we have to do is to insist on popular knowledges, is to insist that the university must not become an ivory tower secluded from society, but is to say that knowledge is everywhere and we have to tap into it. This is not to speak of some instrumental knowledge, but to say that ordinary people have got a great deal of knowledge which has been denied. Okay, so at times we have to consciously just say, look, we're incredibly ignorant. Let's fight for a kind of society where you don't have a university like this place on a hill, which is looking down on the city and educating the city. But let's go there and tap all the knowledges and move all these classrooms there in a metaphorical sense, such that we have a university which is springing out of a social experience, not a university as an isolated space. And final thing on Ghana, so in Ghana there was a protracted struggle in the late 90s when the IMF forced the state to introduce user fees, tuition fees in higher education. For almost a year, the university was closed down. Students militantly resisted and so on. But eventually, student leaders were co-opted by the state. One of the student leaders today, unfortunately, is a minister in Ghana. Ironically, is the Minister of Labor. So the point I'm making is that we have to be cautious of projecting individuals to carry our aspirations. We have to make sure, and that has been the strength of the movement here at UCT, that people share collective responsibility in moving the struggle forward. I think that spirit has to be deepened further. But finally, as we work with workers on this campus and nationally, we must always insist on worker leadership. It is workers that make this place. The hands of workers build these buildings. They clean this place daily. They have the social power, the economic power to transform society. As I said to you earlier on, students, when they are students, do not produce any value as students. So our location in the economic structure makes it impossible for us to bring about fundamental change as students. But we can stand in solidarity with workers in order to create a society where human beings are human, a society, as Che Guevara said, where people become absolutely free because they don't have to sell themselves as commodities.
Brilliant. Thank you very much, Comrade.
Thanks.